Hello and welcome to the Debating Toastcast, a podcast about all things debating, from the Debate Toastmasters Club, 104 London Debaters. Hi and welcome to the Debating Toastcast with your host, me, William Hagerup. I'm one of the debate coaches and 104 London Debaters, a Toastmasters debating club in London. This is going to be the first of a series of relatively short podcast episodes on the topic of rhetoric. The content is based on a workshop we did in the club called Rhetoric, the Building Blocks of Persuasion. And, there was so much material that I gathered in preparation for this workshop. And generally, there is just so much to say about rhetoric that I felt it was better to divide it up into more easily digestible chunks. Rhetoric is, of course, not only relevant for debaters, not at all. The building blocks of rhetoric are fundamental to crafting any good speech, whether it's a Toastmaster one, or a political speech, an academic speech, or indeed a work presentation. At some level, you want to convince your audience of the message you are trying to communicate, and that is what rhetoric will help you to do. And so, as this is the first episode of the series of rhetoric, why don't we start by defining what rhetoric actually is? Rhetoric has been defined by Peter and Susan Cockcroft in their 2005 book, Persuading People, An Introduction to Rhetoric, as the art of persuasive discourse in both spoken and written language. Whereas Aristotle, he said it was the art of identifying what was the most useful means in each particular case to cause persuasion. For instance, the means would be very different in politics than in a court of law, and different again in science than in philosophy. But in any case, the key point of rhetoric is persuading someone through the use of words and linguistic communication, whether spoken or written. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on the whole history of rhetoric because that's something you can study if you like. But it is worth mentioning that as a discipline to be studied and learned, it emerged in the relatively democratic city-states of ancient Greece about 2,500 years ago, and it is in the writing of Aristotle, his book called Rhetoric, that we have what we may call the start of a tradition that continues to this day. Now, today, of course, the role of mass media and social media commercials, in addition to, of course, politics and the law, are all shaping how rhetoric is used. But the basic principles are largely the same as they always were. And being familiar with some of the techniques and approaches will enable you to have a more critical and analytical approach when you come across rhetoric in your everyday life, which you are bound to do, as well as in debates. And of course, it will enable you to apply it appropriately. Another thing Susan and Peter Cockcroft said in their book is that within any society, there seems to be a direct correlation between the erosion of political freedom and the limitation and degeneration of rhetoric. Now, rhetoric can, of course, be used both for evil and for good. But interestingly, it's really only in free societies where we need to persuade one another rather than use force that rhetoric has a central place. And when rhetoric degenerates, we get propaganda from the authorities, but also name-calling or trolling or the overuse of emotional appeal. And we see, of course, there's a lot on social media these days. It's not helpful for rational decision-making, and that, at the end of the day, is what debate is all about. As debaters, I therefore hope we can be dedicated to avoiding that by a responsible and intelligent use of rhetoric. So in order to understand better what rhetoric actually is, it might be useful to ask what the purpose of rhetoric is. And I'm going to suggest that the purpose of rhetoric is to effect, that is, to cause someone else to do something that you want them to do. Now, this definition is based on the aforementioned Cockcroft's book, but it also on a lecture series available on Audible by Professor Michael Drout. That's D-R-O-U-T, Michael Drout, called A Way with Words, where he references the speech act theory. Now, you could, of course, say that, well, perhaps I only want to use rhetoric to convince someone of a particular point of view. I don't necessarily want them to do something or take any particular action. I accept that. But even changing your mind on something is an action, albeit an intellectual or mental action. And in most cases where rhetoric is really useful is where you get someone to agree to do something. In our debates at 104 London Debaters, for example, we want people to, push the button or lift their hands up or whatever mechanics we use for voting in order to support our side, right? It's always a little bit disappointing, actually, for debaters when we get a lot of abstainers after the debate, because we always take 2 votes, one before the debate and then one after the debate. And before the debate, it's fair enough that many people may not have a strong opinion on any particular subject. But then after the debate, we really hope that the arguments convince them to take a stance, at least based on what they heard that evening, who gave the best case, who presented the best and strongest case on that particular evening. And we like to see them show that by actively voting, showing their support either for the proposition or for the opposition. And of course, having a lot of abstainers after the debate is a bit disappointing because, well, it's like we didn't really convince anybody to take the action of showing support for one side or the other. At work, we may want someone to support our project. We want them to say that they support it, to take that action. We want a customer to buy something, to take the action of actually buying something. Or at home, you may want to get your spouse to agree to go on holiday and actually take the plunge of booking the holiday. So where rhetoric is most relevant to us in all areas of life, I think this definition does make sense, that it is about effecting an action in someone else, get them to do something. A good debate speech or any persuasive text will furthermore make use of Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion. These are usually referred to by their Greek terms. That's logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos, the reasoning, is the substantive, logically consistent presentation of your basic argument. What Aristotle said was the proof, or apparent proof, provided by the words of the speech itself. The word logos, incidentally, means word in ancient Greek, but it's also, from that, we obviously derive the word logic. So it's all about the substance of the argument you present. We do have episodes focusing on putting together a strong argument, and no doubt more episodes dedicated to that will follow. So we're not going to talk too much about that in this series on rhetoric. However, we will be dealing with one aspect of the logos which is often overlooked when talking about the logos, and that's something called enthymeme. I'm not going to tell you now what that is because in the next episode we are going to talk about just that very topic. But the second element of a persuasive speech or text is ethos. Aristotle said this had to do with the personal character of the speaker. Essentially, do you trust the speaker? Do you find him to be credible or incredible, which literally means not believable? And again, a dedicated episode on ethos will also follow. Thirdly, we have pathos. Aristotle said this was about putting the audience into a certain frame of mind. It is often thought of as the emotional element, but that can easily be misunderstood to mean merely inserting emotional words or being emotional when you speak, perhaps crying or something, which occasionally can have a role to play. But pathos is much more about how you make your abstract points concrete for the readers or listeners to really grasp, make them concrete, make them graspable. Instead of talking just about highfalutin theory, what does it mean for an individual human being, for example, by examples, by showing in the specifics what this actually means, enabling people to engage with it on a human level, both intellectually but also emotionally, grasping the point that you're trying to make. In conclusion then, for today, in the first episode on rhetoric, we talked about what rhetoric is, namely the act of persuasive discourse in both spoken and written language. using the most useful means in each particular case to cause persuasion. And we talked about the purpose of rhetoric being to effect, that is, to cause someone else to do something that you wish them to do. Obviously voluntarily. We don't want to force them, we want to convince them by the use of rhetoric. That's the whole point of it. And then finally, we looked very briefly at Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion, which we are going to be looking at more closely. Logos, the words conveying the substance of your argument. Ethos, the character of the speaker. Do you find him trustworthy and credible? And pathos, putting your audience into a receptive frame of mind, allowing your listeners to grasp your message emotionally as well as intellectually. And that was episode 1. Now, in the next episode on rhetoric, we are going to talk about what an enthymeme is. Enthymeme, yes. What it is and how you can use it. Until then, thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Debating Toastcast. Feel free to leave a comment, critical or encouraging. We welcome both. And if you'd like more information about joining the club or coming first as a guest, please have a look at our website, 104londondebaters.club, or send us an email on info@104londondebaters.club. That's info@104londondebaters.club. Thank you for listening.